So now that we understand what restorative justice isn't, let's get a better idea of where restorative justice lies in relation to other areas of the criminal justice system. Let's first start to differentiate the different avenues of the criminal justice system by looking at their outcomes. First, let's look at litigation. Litigation is the form of justice that you're probably most familiar with. You have judges and a jury deciding the outcomes. They also have a binding agreement. Whatever the judge says at the end of the trial usually goes. Conversely, we have arbitration. In this instance, the arbitrator controls the outcome, and it's usually binding. However, because the arbitrator controls the outcome, while there are individuals who are engaging in this justice process, there is less opportunity for them to have control over what happens at the end of the process. We also have mediation. In mediation, the parties involved determine the result of what happens. However, because they're determining this result, it is also non-binding. And because it is non-binding, it doesn't necessarily mean that if the agreed parties decide on something, that it will necessarily happen. However, because they have more agency in being able to say what happens and what doesn't happen at the end of the agreement, they usually are more likely to settle an agreement at the end of the day. Restorative justice is most similar to mediation. The parties do determine the result, and it is also non-binding. However, because restorative justice is more concerned with having more parties involved, not just the offender and the victim, but also the community, there's often a greater discussion around what that result might be, and also there's a greater responsibility for each party to determine that result based on the harms enacted. So now that we've discussed the outcomes, let's discuss what's at stake. In the instance of litigation, it is incredibly high risk, and the judge and the jury are in full control over who gets what. Because of this, it can often destroy relationships. Take, for example, divorce proceedings. Frequently, they are handled through litigation. Because these relationships become heavily adversarial, even if they weren't before litigation started, oftentimes the relationship suffers after the fact. Next, let's consider arbitration. Oftentimes, there is a better discussion between the two parties, but it is still on a win-lose basis. Frequently, this can destroy relationships as well. While it's not quite as adversarial and the relationship isn't quite as abstracted as you'll see in litigation, because you have two parties on either side, one winner and one loser as decided by the arbitrator, you still frequently will have relationship dissolution. Next, let's consider mediation. In mediation, parties do agree on the terms, and because of this, it might preserve the relationship. In mediation, parties can negotiate better on who gets what, and because they both have to agree on what happens at the end of the day, the relationship is better preserved. Once again, restorative justice is very similar to mediation in this respect. The parties all do agree on the terms, and while instead of considering that this might preserve the relationship, most of the time in restorative justice, because the relationship is at the forefront of these discussions, the parties agree on terms based on the relationship itself. Now, that's not to say that because they're highly focused on the relationship when we're considering restorative justice, that it means that the relationship is oftentimes better off compared to litigation, arbitration, and mediation. Certainly we would assume so, especially based on the crime or harm involved, but because many times in mediation, what's being discussed might be property or something separate from the parties themselves. And in restorative justice, oftentimes they're focused on harms. You might have a better outcome in the relationship between, say, neighbors in a property dispute, and the victimizer and the victim in some cases with restorative justice. So now that we've discussed the outcomes and what's at stake, let's finally discuss what interactions look like in each of these situations. In litigation, it's largely adversarial. And because outcomes are decided by a judge and jury, oftentimes there is no negotiation or understanding between the two parties. Money and legal outcomes, including jail time, are what often result. In the case of arbitration, it is also frequently adversarial. Because these interactions are still win-lose, frequently you still have one side pitted against another. And due to the increased responsibility of the arbitrator, most outcomes, while they allow for some interaction between the disputants, the arbitrator has final say, and it often comes from a legal basis. In the case of mediation, there's often much more interaction between the disputants, and this allows for much more creative solutions. Because the disputants have much more of a say in what happens at the end of the day, oftentimes you can have solutions that go outside of the legal process and have solutions that maybe are a little more colloquial in nature. Once again, restorative justice is most similar to mediation in this regard. It is incredibly collaborative in nature, and you can come up with incredibly creative solutions toward this end. It is again worth noting that because you not only have the victim and the victimizer involved, but also the community, you can have a greater focus on creative solutions that repair harms for everyone involved. So now that we've seen where restorative justice fits into the criminal justice system, our next video will discuss what restorative justice looks like in practice today. See you in the next video.